Hi, I'm Robbie. Today I'm going to be making a functional wing for my car out of free plywood. Here's the plan. I'm going to make a cambered plate airfoil, and this is by no means cutting edge technology, but this is something that will work and will create downforce, maybe at the cost of not the most maximum amount of downforce, and maybe at the cost of a little more drag. But for the purposes of being made with free plywood and being easy to make, I'm hoping that when I test this, I can still get some pretty good results with the downforce that I do end up creating. So a cambered plate, it basically is just a flat piece of material that is bent. So you can see this is the side view here. I plan to bend the piece of plywood. I'll talk about how I plan to do that in a little bit. But I plan to bend this piece of plywood, and that's why we get the name cambered plate airfoil. That's what it comes from. It is a plate of material that has been cambered or bent. So here's the pieces of free plywood that I got. They're 8 foot long and they're 16 inches wide. I'm quite sure they were in one of my neighbor's basements as some shelving units that they removed, and they put all the wood out on the side of the road to just be thrown away. And so, of course, I grabbed it because I'm a sucker for free stuff. So anyway, I grabbed this wood. You'll see as we get to building it later on that the wood is not in great condition at all. I'm assuming that it probably got wet or something like that. So definitely not great material, but that's why I'm using it to just give a shot here, see how this works. This is 1/3 of a piece of regular plywood, a 4x8 sheet of plywood. 16 inches of it is 1/3. So honestly, between 25 and 50 bucks, you could buy a whole 4x8 sheet of plywood. So 1/3 of that is still going to be quite cheap to build this airfoil. So what are we going to do? Well, first of all, I'm going to cut it to width. So I have 8 feet wide. I'm going to make one cut right along here to 6.5 feet wide, which is my goal width for what I'm going to be making here today. I'm going to cut a slight angle into the last 2 pieces, and I plan to actually use these extra pieces to put underneath to be a support, not only for support the camber of the airfoil, but also to give me somewhere to mount it to my car when I get to that point later on. So anyway, those will be 2 quite simple cuts. Could be done with a circular saw or jigsaw. I'll probably use the circular saw. The last thing is, and this is the last cuts, I guess, we're actually going to make kerfs, and this is how we plan to bend it, or how I plan to bend the piece of plywood. And those are the same things as I'm showing here. I plan to cut 7 or 8 kerfs lengthwise into the plywood. These are cuts that go almost all the way through, but not quite. So maybe you can see in my side view drawing here, they don't quite go all the way through the plywood. And what that does is that allows you to bend it. Hopefully you can see in my drawing that the thickness of the blade is the full thickness down here at the bottom, but up at the top the 2 pieces of wood are touching again. So by cutting these kerfs in the piece of plywood, it's 3/4 inch plywood, 3/4 inches thick, by the way. By cutting these kerfs into it, then that will allow me to bend it and get the camber that I'm hoping for here. So I'll probably use a table saw to cut those kerfs. What else in terms of cutting? Oh yeah, so you can see here that I'm rounding my edges a little bit. So I plan to use a router and just a 1/2 inch round over bit to round very specifically this bottom leading edge corner and this top trailing edge corner. We'll talk about the airflow and the plan for the airflow in just a second, but just by playing around with some simple airfoil calculation tools, I've determined that this is going to be the profile that's going to be both A, very easy for me to create, and B, going to improve my characteristics like my coefficient of downforce, as well as prevent me from creating tons of drag. So, you know, I also looked at maybe rounding this whole front edge, things like that, but what I think is going to end up being best, and of course we'll test it, is doing the round over on the bottom front and the round over at the top rear. The airfoil tools that I'm using to kind of come up with these ideas and do some pre-testing on them before I build anything, airfoiltools.com, lots of great information. And then also, this has been invaluable. It's a tool called JavaFoil, and you can access it from mh-aerotools.de. So anyway, looking to make airfoils for yourselves, definitely check out those websites. Now let's take a look at the JavaFoil that I've prepared to show some visualization of the cambered plate. So here's a static picture of the tool I mentioned before, JavaFoil, and I've built my cambered plate in it. So you can see here that I've rounded this back edge a little bit, and I've tried to round the front bottom leading edge as well. So this should be my cambered plate here. It's just kind of a cool tool to visualize how the airflow might flow over a two-dimensional side view section of a cambered plate wing like this. You can see that there's red up here. The red would be high pressure air, slow moving air. The blue down here would be low pressure air, fast moving air. And you can see why this ends up creating downforce. You can see how some of the air that would maybe normally go above the airfoil ends up getting sucked into the high-speed, low-pressure area below. That's why we have a lot more streamlines below than we do above. And I think that's also why curving that front portion and this back portion here, top portion, kind of help just make sure the flow stays smooth and connected to the airfoil at all times. So anyway, that's what we're going for, and we'll see how it works out. Let's get on to building it. Alright, I'm ready to get started here. I've got my tools laid out. I've got my board, of course. You can see how junky it is. I've got a measuring tape, I've got a circular saw, I've got a router, and I've got some clamps, and you can see that I'm using my porch stair here as a nice working surface for me today. So definitely tools that are not out of reach or anything like that for folks. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and measure out my 6.5 feet and my 18 inches, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut that end off. I have some knots over here that I'd rather not deal with on the wing, so that's why I chose to cut that end off. The end has now been cut off. I grabbed a screwdriver. There were a few staples in here that I pulled out because I didn't want to run over them with my saw. So anyway, ready for the next step. I've got it clamped down. I'm going to go ahead and do a round over route on this front edge. I'll flip the board this way, and then I'll do the same thing again. Okay, my routing is done on both ends. I don't know if you can see it, but I've got a nice smooth, well, sort of nice, smooth round over here. This side is still sharp, and then down here this is my sharp edge as well, and we've got the round over on this side. Now I'm going to decide which I would like to be the top of my wing and which I would like to be the bottom. I think, just from what I've read, that the airflow doesn't quite matter as much on the top as it does on the bottom, because the bottom is where you really need it to stay connected, so you're looking for a smooth surface. Just quickly looking at it, I think this side here I'm going to have be the bottom. because I do have some imperfections in my piece of plywood here. There's a pretty deep hole right here, and also some of this stuff is not quite as great. So I think I'm going to use this side as the top. So the top is the side that I'm going to put down to cut my kerfs into. So that's what I'll be laying out next. Okay, I used the tape measure to mark out every 2 inches, so that means I'm going to have 7 kerf lines. 16 inches divided by 2 is 8, so there are 8 individual 2-inch sections with 7 lines in the middle. And then I've just used a straight edge to go ahead and draw out all these lines for myself. I've decided, instead of dragging out the table saw and getting everything going, that I'm just going to go ahead and set my circular saw depth and rip these out. We'll see how it turns out. So I set my depth on my saw, and I just did a quick test cut here. My goal was to not go all the way through, but to be about 5/8 of depth, leaving me about 1/8 left. So I think I got it pretty good, and did my test cut here to make sure I wasn't going all the way through my material. I'm certainly not. So I think we're ready to cut some kerfs. Okay, we've made all our cuts. I think it turned out pretty well. And now you can see that this bends. Really no big deal. So next is to get it glued up and get it drying. Okay, I've got it all glued up and strapped together here. Hopefully you can see how those kerfs have worked to turn this into a curve. So anyway, I made a couple of rookie mistakes while doing this. One, I almost ran out of wood glue, so this does take a significant amount of wood glue, so make sure you've got plenty on hand before you start if you're going to do something like this. Two is there's actually a lot of wood glue application in a project like this, and the stuff starts to set up pretty fast. So I actually was spraying it with my water bottle a little bit to try and keep it a bit wet so I could work it here. I'm not super worried if it doesn't form great joints. I will be supporting this wing with other wood pieces, you know, the pieces that will attach it to the car, and also probably the end plates. So I'm not super worried about this wood being able to hold itself in this curve, but definitely was running around a little bit like a chicken with my head cut off doing the wood glue. So now I'm making the mounts for this wing. I cut off my test piece of scrap there, and I've just laid out a couple of angles on this. So now this is a 16 by 16 square, and I've done 4.5 inches here, 4.5 inches there, and drawn this line. That'll give me a couple of angles. I'm thinking that's about at the angle I'm going to need for my angle of attack. Should put me around 15 degrees, 15 to 20. We'll see. So now I've cut my angles, and then you can maybe see I've traced out the shape of the wing on both of them here. Just basically held them up against the edge of the wing and traced out that curve. So now I'm going to cut those. Getting ready to mount this up, mount up the wing. So I took my 2 under supports, clamped them together, and I've just done a quick bit of sanding along here to make sure these are going to be, you know, mostly flat, and I think they're looking pretty good. So that's where we're at here. So hopefully it's the same side to side. You never know. See how it works out. So I've got the wing attached here to the supports. Show you a couple small things that I did here quick. One is, I don't know if you can see this, but I drew this line on the supports when they were still next to each other so I could get this reference line, so I could line up the back sharp edge of this plywood here exactly the same on both sides. So you can see I made that reference mark so I could try to get those as similar as possible. I also, drilled pilot holes for all of these, one in each slat, essentially, coming down to the bottom. Did that on both sides. And I did I started at the top. I did put one in at the bottom, only to hold it so I could get the second one. But then the curve of my supports was just slightly more than the curve of my wing. So I went this way to kind of use each screw to suck it down in there a little closer. And I didn't want to pull any here. I didn't know if there was going to really make a difference or not. But I don't know if you can see this, but let me pop this up here. It did end up pulling in very nicely on the bottom there, so we got a good fit. Okay. Here's the completed wing. I think it looks pretty good. It's definitely solid. It does have a little bit of twist in it, but when we attach it to the car, we'll be able to twist that right back out. You can see it pretty solid here. It's less than an inch. Anyway, I did the end plates. They happen to be 20.5 by 13.5 inches. That's the size. They're just rectangles. I chose that size because it was exactly half of a piece of scrap wood I had laying around. So I zipped it in half and put them on there. I found that an easy way to put them on there was to get them lined up where I wanted on one side and drill one hole in it, put one screw in it, and then draw a line along the wing, along the end plate. That allowed me to then take that screw out and drill holes through the end plate just underneath the line, the right distance from the line. And then when I put it back on, put that first screw back into it, I was able to drill my final holes and actually get those screws to hit. I actually found it pretty difficult just visually to try and get the drill bit kind of right in the middle of this cambered piece of wood here. So anyway, there you have it. I did weigh this wing on my bathroom scale here. Came up with about 26 pounds, so certainly not light, but not super heavy when it comes to the weight of a car either. And I've never stood on this wing yet, but that's what everyone seems to do to prove that they're strong. So let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. There you go. Wing surfing. In the next installment, I'll be testing this wing. Let's see how it goes. By the way, I hope you like my tripod here. I just have the phone sitting in my vise. Last thing I just want to point out really quick about these end plates. I had no idea any sort of scientific method to put these on in the right place. That's also why I didn't glue them down or these supports yet. They're just screwed in. That's so that when I'm testing, I can move these things around and see if I can, make a difference. What I did at first, though, for placing this was I really just tried to get about half of the surface area of the end plate above the wing and half of the surface area of the end plate below the wing. That was kind of what I was shooting for. And then, as you may be able to guess, I'm also planning to add on a second element to this wing in the future. So I wanted to give a little space kind of, up here. Thanks for watching.